While my daughter and her husband were away, I secretly bought her a new bed for her birthday. I only wanted to surprise her before they came home. But as two workers removed the old bed, one suddenly froze and shouted, "Sir, you need to see this, right now." He pointed to a strange rectangular seam hidden beneath the floor. When he carefully pried it open, we found a waterproof bag that had clearly been there for years. I immediately sent the workers home and locked the door. But when I opened that bag, I realized someone in my family had been hiding a horrifying secret for 6 years. I'm grateful you chose to spend your time here. Tell me something, where in the world are you watching from right now? Leave your city or country below. Let's build something together on Dad Family Revenge. Some elements of this story are fictional, added for entertainment and to carry a message worth hearing. Any resemblance to specific people or places is coincidental, but what this story has to say is something I hope stays with you. My name is Walter Bennett. I am 65 years old, and I have spent the better part of 4 decades building something from nothing. One contract, one handshake, one delivered order at a time. Bennett Industrial Supply started in a rented warehouse in Queens with 6 employees and a phone that rang maybe twice a day. Now we run 3 facilities across New York and New Jersey, employ close to 180 people, and the phone never stops. I tell you this not to impress you, but because the work is who I am. My wife Margaret used to say I was built out of iron and routine. She wasn't wrong. Margaret passed 7 years ago. Since then, the person closest to me in this world has been my daughter Emily. Emily is 37. She married Derek Hale nearly 10 years ago, and for most of those 10 years, I liked the man. Derek ran Hale Renovation Group, a company that bought distressed properties in New York and Los Angeles, gutted them, and sold them at a profit. He was sharp, well-dressed, and had the kind of easy confidence that made people lean toward him in conversation. In the early years, he called me Dad. I let him. I thought I was watching my daughter build a good life with a good man. I was wrong about a lot of things back then. It started with a Sunday dinner complaint, the kind so ordinary I almost didn't register it. Emily rolled her shoulders back and said the bed in her room was driving her crazy every time Derek shifted in the night. The frame groaned like something about to give out. She laughed when she said it, rubbing the back of her neck. 3 days later was Emily's birthday. Derek was taking her down to Philadelphia for 2 nights, a hotel, some restaurants, a little time away from the city. I decided to use those 2 days to replace the bed. I ordered a solid walnut frame and the best mattress the store carried. I hired 2 installers, Caleb and Mason, men I'd used before for work at my office. They were professionals. They showed up on time. What happened next, I was not prepared for. It was a Tuesday morning, October 7th, when Caleb and Mason began breaking down the old bed frame. The mattress came off first, then the side rails, then the headboard. When they gripped the base frame and lifted, something shifted beneath the floorboards. A panel near the center of the room, hidden perfectly under the frame's footprint, popped loose at one corner and tilted up like a cellar door someone had forgotten to latch. Caleb was the one who looked down first. He crouched over the opening, and I watched his shoulders go rigid. He reached into the gap with both hands and came back up holding a black document bag, the kind used on job sites. Waterproof, sealed with a heavy-duty zipper that was still fully closed. He straightened up, and his face had gone the color of dry concrete. "Sir," he said, and his voice came out smaller than I expected from a man his size. "Should we call someone?" I took the bag from his hands. It was heavier than it looked. The outside was clean, no dust, no moisture damage. Whoever had placed it down there had not done so carelessly. "It's a family matter," I said. "I'll handle it." I paid both men in full, added $100 each, and walked them to the door. When I heard their van pull away from the curb, I locked the front door, carried the bag to the kitchen table, and set it down under the overhead light. Inside, a phone, old model, powered off. A USB drive. A woman's bracelet with a broken clasp. A small key on a plastic tag stamped with the number 317. And a Polaroid photograph. The man in the photograph was Derek. The woman beside him, it took me a few seconds, but I recognized her. Rachel Monroe. She had worked as Derek's accountant for nearly 4 years before disappearing 6 years ago. Derek told everyone she had embezzled from the company and fled to Canada. I had believed him without a second thought. I turned the photograph over. On the back, written in a hand I did not recognize, was a single line. "If I disappear, don't trust Derek." The USB has everything. My chest tightened so sharply, I had to press one hand flat against the table to keep myself steady. My jaw ached from clenching it. The kitchen felt smaller than it ever had before. The same counters, the same window above the sink, the same afternoon light coming through, but all of it pressing in now, like the walls had moved 3 feet closer while I wasn't watching. I did not call Emily. I did not call Derek. I pulled out my phone and called the one person I trusted enough to call. Daniel Hayes picked up on the second ring. "Walter." His voice was easy the way it always was. "What's going on?" "I need you to come over," I said. "Right now. Don't ask me why on the phone." A pause, not the pause of confusion, but the pause of a man recalibrating. "Give me 40 minutes, he said. I sat at the kitchen table with the bag in front of me and did not move until I heard his car in the driveway. Daniel Hayes arrived in 38 minutes, which told me he had not driven the speed limit getting here. I had the front door open before he reached the porch steps. He was 63 years old, broad through the shoulders, with gray at his temples and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, the way he always wore them, ready for fine print, but never quite believing he'd need them. He was in a flannel shirt and work boots, which was what he wore to go fishing, which was what we'd been doing together every other Saturday morning for the past 18 years. To anyone who didn't know him, Daniel Hayes looked like a retired foreman who spent his weekends on a lake and his evenings watching baseball. He stepped through the door, looked at the bag on the kitchen table, and did something I had never seen him do in 18 years of friendship. He reached into the back pocket of his jeans and pulled out a pair of nitrile gloves. My stomach dropped. "Daniel." My voice came out rough, scraped from somewhere low in my chest. "Why do you have those?" He snapped the first glove on without looking up. "Old habit." He pulled on the second. "Before we touch anything else, I need to photograph everything exactly as it sits. Position, condition, contents. Do you have your phone?" "Why does it matter how we photograph it?" He looked up at me then, and his eyes held something I hadn't seen there before. Not alarm, but a focused, practiced calm that had nothing casual about it. The look of a man who had walked into rooms like this before and knew exactly what came next. "Because chain of custody matters," he said. "If what's in that bag is what I think it might be, the way we handle it right now will determine whether it ever sees the inside of a courtroom. Sit down, Walter. Let me work." I sat down. Daniel spent 4 minutes photographing every item in place. The bag, the open zipper, each object laid out on the table in the order we removed it. He narrated quietly as he worked, his voice low, and even the voice of a man reciting a procedure he had followed 1,000 times. When he finished, he set his phone down and looked at me directly. "I worked for the federal government for 22 years, he said. "Financial Crimes Division, FBI. I retired out of the New York field office 11 years ago." He paused, letting that land. "I don't talk about it. When you're in that work long enough, you learn to leave it where you left it. But the habits don't go anywhere. The kitchen felt like it tilted slightly. I gripped the edge of the table with both hands, my knuckles pressing hard against the wood. "You were a federal agent," I said. "Special agent, yes." 18 years, I said. 18 years of fishing and bad jokes, and you never said a word. Something moved across his face, not quite guilt, not quite apology. Something older than both. "No," he said. "I never did. I wanted to be angry about that. I filed it away for later because there were more important things sitting on my kitchen table." Daniel picked up the bracelet first, turning it carefully in his gloved hands. The clasp was broken cleanly, not worn through, snapped the way metal snaps when it's pulled hard and fast. He set it down and examined the small key on its plastic tag, the number 317, stamped in faded black ink. "Self-storage," he said. "Most likely, I can run the number." Then he picked up the phone. It was an older model, the screen dark and unresponsive. He connected it to a small portable charger he pulled from his jacket pocket. Another old habit, apparently, and we waited. 40 seconds later, the screen flickered. A lock screen appeared, asking for a 6-digit passcode. Daniel picked up the bracelet again. He turned it slowly under the kitchen light until the interior of the clasp caught the beam. 6 small numbers stamped into the metal on the inside curve. He entered them. The phone unlocked. My throat tightened so sharply I had to swallow twice. On the screen were photographs, text messages, and a folder of audio files. Daniel opened the audio folder. There were 9 files each labeled with a date. He looked at me over the top of his reading glasses. "Do you want to hear the last one first?" he asked. Every instinct I had told me no. Every instinct told me that whatever was in that file was going to change the shape of everything I thought I knew, and that once I heard it, I could not unhear it, and that there was a version of this afternoon where I put the bag back in the bag, put the bag back under the floor, and went home and never thought about it again. "Yes," I said. "Play it." Daniel pressed the screen. A woman's voice came through the speaker, first tight with fear, the words pushed out fast like she was running out of time to say them. "Derek, Miguel is dead." Then a man's voice. A voice I had heard at my dinner table at my daughter's birthday parties, at every holiday gathering for 10 years. A voice that had called me Dad with what I had believed was genuine affection. The voice was completely calm. "I know." The woman again, her breath audible, now ragged at the edges. "You knew he was down there? Locked the back door." And Derek's answer delivered with the flat, empty patience of a man discussing something that had already been decided. "He wasn't supposed to be there." Then a second male voice, lower, harder, familiar in a way that sent a cold line straight down my spine. "Stop talking here. Delete everything and go." I knew that voice too. My hand came up and covered my mouth. Before I understood, it was moving. My eyes burned with a heat that had nothing to do with tiredness, and I put one hand flat over my mouth and stood very still, breathing slowly through my nose, because the alternative was falling apart in a woman's living room, and I was not going to do that. "Play it again," I said. Daniel looked at me carefully. "Walter, play it again, Daniel. Please." He played it again. I listened to every word a second time with my hands flat on the table and my jaw so tight I could feel it in my back teeth. When it ended, I stood up, walked to the window, stood there with one hand braced on the frame, looking out at the ordinary afternoon street below, at a neighbor walking a dog, at a UPS truck pulling away from the curb 2 houses down. "Miguel Alvarez," I said. "Tell me what you remember about him." "Yeah, electrician. He died in a house fire, one of Derek's renovation projects in Brooklyn, 6 years ago. My voice came out steadier than I deserved credit for. Derek organized a fundraiser for his family. I wrote a check for $5,000. Daniel set the phone down on the table very carefully, the way you set something down when you want to make sure it doesn't break. "Then we need to talk," he said, "about what comes next." Daniel made coffee without asking if I wanted any. He moved through my daughter's kitchen, the way a man moves through a space when he needs his hands doing something, while his mind works opening cabinets, finding the filters, filling the carafe. I watched him from the table and said nothing, because the alternative was talking, and I wasn't ready to talk yet. The recording was still playing on a loop somewhere inside my skull. Derek's voice. That terrible, flat calm. He wasn't supposed to be there. When Daniel set a mug in front of me, I wrapped both hands around it even though the evening was warm. My hands needed something solid to hold on to. "Victor Shaw?" I said. That was his voice on the recording. The second one. Daniel pulled out the chair across from me and sat down. He took his reading glasses off his forehead and set them on the table. "Tell me about him." He and Derek have been close for years. Business partner more or less, though I don't think it was ever formalized on paper. Victor brokers real estate deals in Los Angeles, connects buyers with off-market properties, takes a percentage. Derek used him to source renovation targets on the West Coast. I pressed my thumb hard against the rim of the mug. "He's eaten Thanksgiving dinner at this table 3 times. Daniel nodded slowly, the way he nodded when he was filing information, rather than responding to it. "And 6 years ago, the fire. Walk me through what you remember." I breathed in through my nose and pushed it out steadily. "Brooklyn. One of Derek's projects, a 3-story brownstone he was gutting and flipping. The fire started sometime around midnight. By the time the crews got there, the ground floor and basement were fully involved." My throat tightened around the next part. Miguel Alvarez was a subcontractor Derek had hired for the electrical work. He'd been sleeping in the basement because he had an early start the next morning. The official finding was faulty wiring, accidental. I stopped. Derek set up a memorial fund within the week. He stood up in front of everyone and talked about what a tragedy it was. "And you donated $5,000. The words tasted like something rotten. I felt good about it. Daniel picked up his coffee mug but didn't drink from it. He turned it slowly in both hands, and I recognized the gesture. It was what he did when he was deciding how much to say and in what order. "I made a call before I came over," he said. I looked up sharply. "To who?" "Someone I trust at the FBI field office in Manhattan." I didn't give details. I told him I might have something worth looking at and asked him to stand by. He set the mug down. "The way you sounded on the phone, Walter. I've heard that specific tone before. People find things they were never supposed to find. I wanted to have a line open before I knew what this was." The back of my neck went cold. "You called the FBI before you even saw what was in the bag?" "Yes. Daniel, I don't even know what we're dealing with yet. You're already—" "I know enough." His voice didn't rise, but it landed with a weight that stopped me mid-sentence. "That recording is evidence of prior knowledge in connection with a fatal fire. If the official finding was accidental and that recording exists, someone suppressed information during the investigation. That is obstruction of justice, Walter. And if Miguel Alvarez died because someone deliberately prevented him from escaping that building." He stopped, and the pause carried more weight than any word he could have chosen. "That is not a family matter. That is a federal matter." My chest ached with a pressure that had nothing to do with my heart rate. I pressed 2 fingers hard against my sternum and held them there, pushing back against something that wanted to crack open. "What do we do?" I asked. First, and I need you to hear me clearly on this, you do not confront anyone. Daniel leaned forward, both forearms flat on the table. Not Derek, not Victor, not Emily. The moment you tip your hand, evidence disappears. People lawyer up, and whatever case exists evaporates before it begins. Do you understand me? The word Emily hit me somewhere below the ribs. Emily doesn't know anything about this. Something crossed Daniel's face, quick, controlled, there and gone. Probably not, he said. But until we know what we're dealing with, we keep the circle as small as possible. You and me. Nobody else. Agreed. The word came out thin. What's next? The USB drive. He picked it up from the table, turning it between his gloved fingers. I'm not opening this on any device connected to your network or mine. I have a contact retired forensics specialist, worked digital evidence for 15 years. I'll have him extract everything by tomorrow morning. He set the USB down carefully. And this key. He held up the small key on its plastic tag. The number 317 caught the kitchen light. Self-storage unit, I said. Almost certainly. The tag style matches a chain that operates across the 5 boroughs and into New Jersey. I'll cross-reference the number tonight. He slid the key into a small evidence bag he'd produced from somewhere, another pocket, another old habit, and sealed it. 2 days, Walter. Give me 2 days before we move on anything. If we go in with fragments, whoever is behind this has time to build a wall. We go in with everything all at once, and there's no wall left to build. I thought about Derek's voice on that recording. The absence of anything resembling remorse. He wasn't supposed to be there, as though a man's life were a scheduling inconvenience. My jaw tightened until I felt the pressure behind my ears. 2 days, I said. Daniel stood and began carefully replacing each item into the black document bag. His movements were precise and unhurried, the movements of a man who had spent 2 decades doing exactly this and had learned long ago that patience was not a virtue in this work. It was a weapon. At the door, he paused with his hand on the frame and looked back at me. For just a moment, the professional composure shifted, and I saw something underneath it. Something that looked very much like the face of a man who was sorry for what his friend was about to go through. Lock up after I leave, he said. And Walter, don't call Derek tonight. Whatever you're feeling right now, you hold it. I'll hold it, I said. My hands were balled into fists at my sides, the knuckles aching, and I was holding it so hard, my whole body was shaking with the effort of it. Daniel nodded once. Then he was gone. I stood in my daughter's kitchen in the house she shared with a man I had trusted for 10 years, and I listened to the sound of Daniel's car pulling away from the curb. The overhead light hummed faintly. The coffee had gone cold. I walked to the window above the sink and gripped the counter with both hands until my knuckles went white, staring out at the dark October street below, and I made myself breathe. 2 days. I could hold it for 2 days. Daniel called at 7:40 in the morning. I had been awake since 4:30, sitting at my own kitchen table in Queens with a cup of coffee I kept forgetting to drink, watching the October darkness outside my window slowly turn gray. When my phone lit up with his name, I picked it up before the first ring finished. I found the storage unit, he said. South Bronx. We need to go this morning. I was in my jacket before he finished the sentence. We drove separately and met in the parking lot of a self-storage facility on Exterior Street, a long, low building sandwiched between a concrete yard and an elevated section of highway. The morning traffic above us was already grinding steadily. Daniel was waiting at the entrance, his breath visible in the cold air, a paper cup of coffee in each hand. He passed one to me without a word, and led me inside. The facility manager, a heavy-set man named Roy, who looked like he hadn't slept well in several years, confirmed that Unit 317 was registered to a corporate account under the name Hale Renovation Group. Daniel showed Roy a business card I had never seen before and said 3 words that made Roy's entire posture change: former federal agent. Roy took us back himself. The unit was at the end of a long corridor that smelled like motor oil and cardboard. Roy unlocked the outer gate and stepped back. Daniel pulled on his gloves. I turned the key. The door rolled up. I had prepared myself for almost anything. Cash, documents, something that would make my stomach turn. What I had not prepared for was how empty the unit was. A folding chair sat open in the center of the concrete floor. Beside it, a single cardboard box sealed with tape that had begun to yellow at the edges. That was everything. Daniel crouched beside the box and slit the tape carefully with a small blade from his jacket. Inside, folded women's clothing, a small photo album with a water-damaged cover, a bundle of letters held together with a rubber band, and at the bottom, a passport. I picked up the passport. Rachel Monroe. The photograph inside matched the woman from the Polaroid, younger here, softer around the eyes, but unmistakably her. I turned to the back pages. No entry stamps, no exit records. Nothing to suggest this document had been used for international travel at any point in the past 6 years. My chest tightened like something was wrapping around it and pulling. Derek told everyone she went to Canada, I said. My voice came out rougher than I intended, scraping against something raw in my throat. He said she ran, that she was afraid of being caught for the embezzlement. He said a lot of things. Daniel reached into the bottom of the box and produced a small memory card in a plastic sleeve. He held it up to the fluorescent light. Let's see what she left behind. We drove to Daniel's house on the east side of Queens. He had a laptop set up in his home office that had never been connected to the internet, a precaution from his working years that he had never bothered to undo. He inserted the memory card, and a single image file opened. The photograph showed Rachel Monroe standing in front of a roadside motel. She was wearing a dark jacket and carrying a paper coffee cup, squinting slightly against the morning light. In the background, the motel sign was partially visible, the letters NEWAR on a green panel before the frame cut off. Newark, New Jersey. The timestamp burned in the lower right corner of the image 11 days after the date Derek had stood in front of his employees and told them Rachel Monroe had fled the country. I leaned closer to the screen. My eyes moved to the far edge of the frame, to the parking lot visible behind Rachel's left shoulder. A vehicle sat at the far end of the lot, dark, a pickup truck partially cropped by the frame's edge. I recognized the truck before my brain fully caught up with what that recognition meant. The color. The aftermarket running lights along the roof. The particular dent above the rear wheel well that I had noticed once when I helped the owner back it out of a tight parking spot at a family barbecue. The truck belonged to Victor Shaw. The air went out of me so fast, I had to put one hand on the desk to keep from stepping backward. My heart was hammering against my ribs with a force I could feel in my fingertips, and my throat had closed down to almost nothing, and I stood there pressing my palm flat against Daniel's desk and breathing through my nose in slow, deliberate counts, because I was 65 years old, and my cardiologist had opinions about moments exactly like this one. She didn't run, I said. The words came out barely above a scrape. She was still here. 11 days after Derek said she was gone, she was 40 minutes from Manhattan, and Victor Shaw's truck was in the same parking lot. Daniel looked at me steadily. Rachel Monroe didn't leave New York because she wanted to, he said. She left because someone was looking for her. I straightened up, pressed the heels of both hands against my eyes until I saw colors. dropped them, looked at the photograph again. "Then where is she now?" I asked. "That," Daniel said, pulling out his legal pad, "is what we find out next." My phone rang at 8:50 the next morning. Carol Harper had been with Bennett Industrial for 18 years. She was 51, precise in everything she did, and in 18 years I had never once received a call from her that wasn't completely justified. When her name appeared on my screen, I picked up immediately. Mr. Bennett. Her voice was steady, but underneath the steadiness was something strained, the sound of a person who had been sitting on something uncomfortable for too long and had finally decided she couldn't sit on it anymore. "I need to show you something. Are you able to come in this morning?" "Tell me now," I said. A pause. "There's a company operating under the name Bennett Equipment Holdings LLC. They've been signing contracts with real estate development partners in New York and Los Angeles. The letterhead uses our address. The signatory name on 3 of the contracts." She stopped, cleared her throat. "It's yours, Mr. Bennett. Your full name and your title." The room tilted slightly. I pressed my back against the kitchen wall and stayed there. "I've never heard of that company," I said. "I know." Her voice cracked on the second word, just slightly the way a surface cracks before it gives. "I've known about this for 2 weeks. I kept telling myself I was misreading it, that there was an explanation I wasn't seeing. But this morning, I found a loan application, $800,000, submitted to a commercial lender in Los Angeles, and your signature is on the collateral agreement." A shaking breath came through the line. "Mr. Bennett, I am so sorry I didn't call sooner. I was scared, and that was wrong, and I am deeply sorry. You're calling now," I said. "That's what matters. Don't touch anything. Don't tell anyone. I'll be in this afternoon." I hung up and called Daniel. He arrived at my office 2 hours later with his forensics contacts, extracted files from the USB drive loaded onto his offline laptop. We spread everything across the conference table and spent the rest of the afternoon building a picture that made my stomach turn over slowly, steadily, like something grinding in the wrong direction. Bennett Equipment Holdings LLC had been incorporated in Delaware 28 months ago. Delaware required minimal ownership disclosure, which was exactly why someone who wanted to hide had chosen it. The registered agent was a law firm in Midtown that specialized in exactly this kind of structural opacity. The company had positioned itself as a subsidiary partner of Bennett Industrial Supply, using our address, our reputation, and my name to establish credibility with investors and lenders who had no reason to question it. The money moved in layers. Inflated renovation contracts, payments to shell vendors, transfers between accounts that existed only on paper. Daniel pointed to each transaction on the screen with the capped end of his pen, walking me through it the way you walk someone through a crime scene, methodically, without drama, because the facts were dramatic enough on their own. The total figure accumulated over 6 years was $8.7 million. "There's something else," Daniel said. He scrolled to a separate column of transactions. $1.4 million that moved through the network didn't go to Derek's accounts. It went somewhere else entirely. He tapped the screen. "Victor Shaw has been skimming from the inside. Derek doesn't know." I stood up from my chair and walked to the window. 14 floors below Manhattan moved with its usual indifference. Taxis, delivery trucks, pedestrians with their heads down against the October wind. I watched it for a moment, then turned back. "He built this on my name," I said. The words came out flat and cold, the way words come out when there is too much feeling behind them for any of it to show. 10 years of Sunday dinners, and he was using my name to borrow money I never agreed to borrow. "Yes," Daniel said. He didn't soften it. He knew better than to soften it. My jaw tightened until I felt the pressure all the way into my temples. I thought about every handshake, every introduction, every time I had vouched for Derek Hale to a business contact or a banker or a vendor, and I understood now what each of those moments had actually been: raw material. Credibility. He was quietly harvesting and turning into something I never would have given him if he had simply asked. "How much of my actual company is exposed?" I asked. "Ma, Carol's books are clean," Daniel said. "She kept everything separated. Whoever built this knew better than to touch the real accounts, directly too much scrutiny. They built around you, not through you." He paused. "But Walter, if this surfaces without us controlling how it surfaces, you are the name investigators see first." I nodded slowly. "Then we control how it surfaces." Daniel reached into his jacket and pulled out his legal pad. At the top of a fresh page, he wrote one word and underlined it twice. The word was Louisville. "I found her," he said. "I left Queens at 5:45 in the morning." Daniel had given me an address on a residential street in the eastern part of Louisville, Kentucky. A neighborhood of small houses with chain-link fences and mature trees that had gone full amber in the October cold. He had also given me one instruction: go alone. No calls ahead. No warning. If Rachel Monroe had been running for 6 years, a phone call from a stranger would put her back in her car before I reached the city limits. 9 hours on the road gave me too much time to think. I drove south through New Jersey and into Pennsylvania, the interstate opening up as the morning traffic thinned, and I thought about Derek standing at my daughter's kitchen table 2 Christmases ago, laughing at something I'd said, his hand on Emily's shoulder. I thought about Victor Shaw eating my wife's cranberry sauce at Thanksgiving and asking for the recipe. I thought about Miguel Alvarez, whose name I had written on a donation check, without ever knowing the real shape of what had happened to him. By the time I crossed into Kentucky, my hands were so tight on the wheel that my knuckles had gone numb. I made myself open them one at a time, flex my fingers, breathe. I found the street just after 2 in the afternoon. The house was small, white, siding a narrow porch, 2 clay pots with dead flowers flanking the front steps. A wind chime turned slowly in the October breeze. Everything about it was chosen to be unremarkable, the kind of house that neighborhood eyes slide right past without registering. I sat in the car for 3 minutes. Then I got out and walked up the path and knocked. Footsteps inside. A pause, the particular pause of someone checking through a window before committing to the door. Then the sound of a deadbolt turning. The woman who opened the door had aged in the way that hard years age, a person, not just lines in the face, but a guardedness in the eyes, a way of holding herself that was always half ready to step back. Her hair was shorter than in the Polaroid. She was thinner, but I recognized her immediately, and the moment she recognized me, the color left her face so completely that I instinctively reached out one hand in case she needed something to hold on to. "Mr. Bennett," she whispered. "I found the phone, Rachel," I said. Her hand came up and pressed flat against her mouth. Her eyes filled so fast and so completely that the tears were running down her face before she'd taken another breath. Not slow, dignified tears, but the kind that come when something you have been holding for 6 years suddenly has somewhere to go. Her shoulders shook with it. She gripped the doorframe with her free hand, hard enough that her knuckles whitened, and she made a sound behind her palm that was somewhere between a sob and a gasp. The sound of a person who has been waiting for exactly this moment and is not prepared for how it feels now that it's here. I stood on her porch and waited because there was nothing else to do. After a moment, she stepped back and opened the door wider. I followed her inside. The living room was spare and clean, a second-hand couch, a small television, a bookshelf with paperbacks arranged by color rather than title, the habit of someone who had built a life out of whatever was available and made it orderly anyway. She sat down on the edge of the couch. I took the chair across from her. "How did you find me?" she asked. Her voice was still unsteady, still wet at the edges. A friend with the right background," I said. "He's trustworthy. You don't need to worry about him." She nodded, pressing the back of her wrist against each eye in turn. Her hands were trembling, a fine, constant tremor she didn't try to hide. "Derek's men came within 2 blocks of this address 14 months ago," she said. "I had a bag packed for 3 weeks after that. I slept with my car keys on the nightstand. The thought of my daughter's husband sending people to find this woman who had done nothing more than witness something she was never supposed to see, put a cold, hard pressure behind my sternum that I had to breathe against slowly. "Tell me what happened," I said. "The night of the fire. Tell me everything." Rachel looked at her hands for a moment. Then she looked up at me, and the guardedness in her eyes shifted into something else, something that had been waiting a long time for permission to come out. "I saw them go in," she said. "Derek and Victor. I was parked across the street because I'd gone back to get files I'd left in the office. I knew something was wrong with the books, and I was scared. I watched them carry things inside." She stopped, drew a breath. There was a light on in the basement window. I knew Miguel was down there. He'd mentioned that morning he was going to sleep on site because of the early start. Her voice dropped to almost nothing. "I called Derek's cell from my car. He picked up. I told him Miguel was in the basement." She pressed her lips together until they went white. "And he said he knew." Just like that. He knew. And then the light in that basement window changed. My throat had closed down to almost nothing. I pressed 2 fingers hard against the bridge of my nose and held them there. "Andy, I ran," she said. "I drove away, and I called Emily from a gas station payphone 3 miles down the road, and I told her what I had seen." I went very still. "Emily," I said. Rachel looked at me steadily, her wet eyes holding mine. "Yes, Mr. Bennett," she said. "Emily knew that night." I sat with that for a long moment, not because I didn't believe her. I believed her immediately, the way you believe something when it explains every small, inexplicable thing you have been filing away for years without knowing what to do with it. The way Emily looked sometimes when Derek entered a room. The particular exhaustion she carried that I had always attributed to work, to the city, to the ordinary weight of adult life. The way she hugged me goodbye at the end of every visit, too long, too tight, like someone holding onto a handhold above a drop. I had seen all of it. I had understood none of it. "Tell me everything," I said. "From the beginning." Rachel pulled her sleeves down over her hands. She had stopped crying, but her eyes were still swollen, and her voice came out rough at the edges, scraped thin by 6 years of keeping everything inside a space too small for it. "The night I called Emily," she said, "she came to me within the hour. She drove to where I was, a gas station off the highway, and when she got out of the car, her hands were shaking so badly she could barely get her keys into her pocket." Rachel pressed her lips together hard. She already knew something was wrong with Derek. Not the fire, she didn't know about Miguel yet, but she'd seen him going through my desk at the office the week before. "She never told me any of this," I said. "She couldn't." Rachel's wet eyes held mine without flinching. 2 days after the fire, Derek sat Emily down and showed her documents. Financial records, loan applications, all of them with your name on them. "Mr. Bennett. Your signature, your title, your company address." He told her that if any of this came out, investigators would look at you first, that the paper trail led directly to you. She paused. He told her he could make it go away, that as long as she stayed quiet, You were safe. The cold pressure behind my sternum spread outward until I could feel it in both shoulders. He used my name to build the fraud, I said, and then used the fraud to keep my daughter quiet. Yes. The word came out barely above a breath. Before I left that night, Emily told me about the compartment in the bedroom floor. Derek had shown it to her when he built it, proud of himself. She told me to put everything into a bag and leave it there. She said it was the one place Derek would never look because he didn't know she knew about it. I thought about Derek building that compartment with his own hands, building his own hiding place, never knowing his wife had turned it against him. Why didn't she come to me? I asked. The question came out raw, scraped from somewhere low and undefended. 6 years, Rachel. Rachel's eyes filled again, the tears tracking down slowly. About 8 months after the fire, she said, a transaction connected to the company Derek built on your name got flagged in an IRS audit inquiry. It landed on your personal tax records. Derek showed Emily the flag, showed her exactly how close it had come, then made it disappear. And then he looked at her and said, next time, I might not be able to fix it. The small Louisville living room felt very quiet. She believed him, I said. She believed him because she watched him do exactly what he said he could do. She wasn't protecting Derek. She was terrified that the moment she spoke, you would be the one who paid for it. I stood up, walked to the window, pressed my hand against the frame and looked out at the amber trees on the quiet street, and let myself feel the full weight of what 6 years had cost my daughter. My eyes burned. I pressed the back of my wrist hard against them. Then I turned around, sat down, looked at Rachel Monroe, this woman who had spent 6 years sleeping with her car keys on the nightstand, and made her a promise. You're done running, I said. Both of you. Rachel's chin trembled. She pressed her hand over her mouth and nodded, and the tears came again, quiet and steady, the tears of someone who has just been told they can finally put something down. I drove back to New York that night. 9 hours. Radio off. Yellow lines coming and going in the headlights. I thought about Emily the whole way home, not with anger, not even a trace of it. Only a grief so deep and so quiet it barely felt like an emotion at all. More like a landscape. Something you moved through rather than something that moved through you. I had one more thing to do before I could go to her. Before I tell you what I decided to do next, drop a dad in the comments right now, so I know you're still with me. Because what I'm about to reveal changes everything you thought you understood about this story. A quick note. Some elements of this story are fictional, crafted for entertainment, and to carry a message worth hearing. If that's not what you came for, no judgment at all, this is your moment to step away. But if you're staying, you'll want to hear what comes next. I got back to Queens at 4 in the morning. I sat in my car in the driveway for 10 minutes before going inside. The house was dark and quiet, the way only an empty house is quiet. Not peaceful, just absent. I went to the kitchen, filled a glass of water, drank half of it, and poured the rest down the drain. Then I went upstairs and lay down on top of the covers with my jacket still on, and stared at the ceiling until the October sky outside my window turned from black to gray to the pale, thin blue of early morning. I did not sleep. By 7, I was dressed. By 7:30, I was at the office. And by 8 o'clock, I had made a decision that went against every instinct I had spent 65 years developing. I was not going to confront Derek Hale. Not yet. Carol was already at her desk when I arrived, which told me she had not slept well either. She looked up when I came through her door, and the relief on her face was so complete, it was almost painful to look at the relief of someone who has been waiting alone in a burning building and has just heard footsteps on the stairs. Close the door, I said. She closed it. I need everything you have on Bennett Equipment Holdings, I said. Every document, every transaction record, every contract you found with my name on it. Printed copies, originals where possible. You keep one set locked in your personal drawer. You give me one set this afternoon. You tell no one, not your assistant, not accounting, not anyone in this building. I paused. And Carol, you did the right thing calling me. I want you to know that. Her eyes went bright and wet at the corners. She pressed her lips together, hard, nodded twice, and picked up her pen. I left her office and called Daniel from the stairwell. I'm back, I said. We need to move. How are you holding up? I'm functional. That's enough for now. I pushed through the stairwell door and walked toward my office. Tell me about the trap. Daniel had spent the weekend building it. The mechanism was straightforward, a single transaction record from the Bennett Equipment Holdings network, slightly modified to suggest that money had been moved through an account connected to Victor Shaw without Derek's knowledge. Not fabricated, the underlying transaction was real, pulled from the USB data. Daniel had simply surfaced it through a channel that Derek's financial manager monitored, a man named Garrett, who processed incoming wire confirmations and was known in the way these things are known in tight business circles, to keep Derek closely informed. Garrett will see it by end of day, Daniel said. Derek will know by tonight. And Derek will think Victor is moving against him. Yes, which means Derek will call Victor, which means they start watching each other instead of watching us. I sat down at my desk and looked out at the Manhattan skyline through my office window. 40 years of mornings at a desk. 40 years of problems that had solutions if you were patient enough and precise enough to find them. Do it, I said. The call from Derek came 2 days later. Wednesday morning, 9:17. I was reviewing vendor contracts when my phone buzzed on the desk. His name on the screen, same as it had appeared 1,000 times before. I let it ring twice. Breathed in. Put the CEO face on. The one that showed nothing. Derek, I said. Good morning. Morning, Dad. His voice was warm, easy calibrated to exactly the right frequency of casual. But underneath it, underneath the surface, in the slight overemphasis on certain words, in the quarter-second pause before he spoke, I could hear it. The tension of a man who was trying very hard to sound like he had nothing to worry about. Hey, have you spoken to Victor recently? Victor. I leaned back in my chair. Not in a few weeks. Why? No reason. Just there's a business thing I'm trying to sort out. I thought maybe you'd run into him. Can't help you there, I said pleasantly. Everything okay? Absolutely. The word came out a half-beat too fast. Everything's great. How are you? How's the knee holding up? We talked for 4 more minutes about nothing. He asked after my health, mentioned a restaurant he wanted to take me to, said he was looking forward to seeing me at the showroom event in 2 weeks. He called me Dad twice more. I matched his tone note for note, laughed where laughing was appropriate, and when I hung up, I set the phone face down on my desk and sat very still with my hands flat on the surface in front of me. He was rattled, not panicked. Derek Hale did not panic, which was one of the things that made him dangerous. But rattled. Uncertain. For the first time in 6 years, something in his world was not behaving the way he expected it to behave, and he didn't know why. Good. That evening, Daniel sent me a single text message, a screenshot from a parking lot security camera mounted outside Derek's Midtown office building. Timestamp 9:47 p.m. Two men standing in the lot close enough that their conversation was clearly not casual. Derek, his jacket off despite the cold, his shoulders rigid. Victor Shaw, his hands moving as he talked, his face angled up and forward the way faces angle when the words behind them have an edge. They argued for 22 minutes. I looked at that screenshot for a long time. Then I set my phone down, walked to the kitchen, and made myself a proper dinner for the first time in a week. Scrambled eggs and toast. I sat at my own table in my own house and ate every bite. The trap was working. Daniel called at 6:58 on Thursday morning. I was already dressed, already on my second cup of coffee, already sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop open and a legal pad covered in notes I had been adding to since 5 a.m. When his name came up on my phone, I picked it up and said, "Tell me." "Victor found the 2.1 million, Daniel said. He knows Derek moved it without him." I set my coffee mug down carefully. "How bad is it?" Bad enough that Victor called Derek at 11:30 last night and used the word attorney on the call. My contact at the field office flagged it. A pause. "Victor isn't just angry, Walter. He's scared. A scared man with something to lose is the most unpredictable thing in any situation. He'll burn the whole structure down if he thinks it's the only way to save himself." "What's he going to do?" "He already did something." I heard Daniel pull a breath. "This morning at 4:47, Victor sent a file to Emily's personal email address. A video file. My contact intercepted a copy through the network monitor we placed on Victor's accounts." Another pause, shorter this time. The pause of a man choosing his next words carefully. "Walter, it's footage from the night of the Brooklyn fire. Whoever recorded it was standing across the street. You can see Derek and Victor entering the building. You can see the basement window. And you can see Derek pull the back door shut and lock it from the outside." My hand came up and pressed flat against my sternum. The pressure behind my ribs was enormous, not pain exactly, but something that occupied the same space pain occupies, pushing outward from the inside. "He sent it to Emily," I said, "with a message, 3 sentences." Daniel read from something I could hear the faint crinkle of paper. "Ask your husband what really happened to Miguel Alvarez. He has until Friday to make this right. Or everyone finds out." He set the paper down. "Victor thinks Emily will panic and pressure Derek into paying. He thinks she's a pressure point, not a person." I stood up from the table, walked to the window. The Queen's morning outside was gray and cold, the kind of cold that had settled in and decided it was staying. A school bus moved slowly down the block. A woman walked a dog in a yellow rain jacket. Everything ordinary. Everything exactly as it had always been. "He's going to find out he chose the wrong woman," I said. "I think so too." Daniel's voice carried something close to satisfaction. "But Walter, there's more. The reason Victor is panicking this hard, this fast, it's not just the 2.1 million. A pause. "Derek bought 2 cans of accelerant at a hardware store in Harlem on Monday evening. We picked it up on a purchase flag through his business card." The ordinary Queen's morning outside my window went very cold. "He was going to meet Victor," I said slowly. "At the Bronx property. Tuesday night. They had a meeting scheduled. Victor showed up armed with a lawyer's phone number and a recording. Derek showed up with 2 cans of accelerant, and we believed the intention of making sure Victor Shaw never made it to that phone call." I pressed my forehead against the cold glass of the window and stayed there for 3 seconds, feeling the chill of it spread across my skin. "6 years ago, it was Miguel," I said. "Tuesday, it was almost Victor." "Yes." Daniel's voice was flat and certain. "Victor figured out something was wrong before he got to the building. His lawyer called him on the way there with a contract question. that kept him on the phone long enough to reconsider. He turned around. He went home. A beat. He doesn't know how close it was, but he knows Derek well enough to be genuinely frightened now, which is why he sent that video to Emily at 4 in the morning instead of waiting for a more strategic moment. I pushed back from the window and stood in the center of my kitchen with both hands at my sides, breathing steadily through my nose, the way my cardiologist had taught me in for 4 hold for 4 out for 4, because my heart was doing something urgent against my ribcage, and I needed it to slow down. Victor had sent that video to scare Emily, to use her as leverage, to make her a tool in a transaction between two men who had spent 6 years treating everyone around them as tools. My daughter had opened her email at 4:47 in the morning and watched a video of her husband locking a man inside a burning building, alone. I grabbed my jacket off the hook by the door. "Walter," Daniel's voice sharpened. "What are you doing?" "I'm going to Emily. She hasn't called you yet." "She will." I was already pulling the door open, already stepping out into the cold October morning. "And when she does, I want to already be on my way." I was halfway down the driveway when my phone buzzed in my hand. "Emily." I answered before I finished reading her name on the screen. "Dad." Her voice came through the speaker, fractured and thin, the voice of someone who had been crying for a long time and had run out of tears, but not out of pain. "Can you come over?" "I'm already in the car," I said. She had left the front door unlocked. I found it that way when I arrived. Not open, just unlocked, the kind of unlocked that says I knew you were coming, and I didn't have the strength to wait at the door. I let myself in and found Emily sitting at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a mug she wasn't drinking from, her laptop open in front of her, the screen dark. She had been crying for a long time. I could see it in the swelling around her eyes, in the rawness of her skin, in the way she was holding herself, very still, very upright. The posture of someone who has used up everything they had and is now running on the structural memory of how a person is supposed to sit. She looked up when I came in. "You already know," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "How long?" "Long enough." Her face crumpled. Not gradually, all at once, the way a structure fails when the load finally exceeds what the foundation can hold. She pressed both hands over her mouth and bent forward over the table, and the sound that came out of her was something I had not heard from my daughter since she was 9 years old and had fallen off her bicycle and broken her wrist raw and unguarded and completely without defense. Her shoulders shook with it. Her whole body shook with it. I crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and put my arms around her from behind and held on. She grabbed my forearms with both hands and held on right back, her fingers digging in hard, and she cried the way people cry when they have been saving it up for 6 years, not in waves but all at once. Everything at the same time, grief and relief and shame and exhaustion pouring out of her with a force that shook her shoulders and made her breath come in ragged, tearing gasps. I did not say anything. I just held her. After a while, the shaking slowed. Her grip on my forearms loosened slightly. She straightened up, pressed the heels of her hands hard against her eyes, and drew a long, unsteady breath that came out in pieces. "I'm sorry," she said. Her voice was wrecked, hoarse and thin, and completely stripped of anything except the truth of it. "Dad, I am so sorry." "You don't need to apologize to me," I said. I pulled out the chair beside her and sat down so we were level, so she didn't have to look up. "I need you to talk to me, that's all. Just tell me." She told me. It came out haltingly. At first, the night Rachel called the drive to the gas station, Derek's face 2 days later when he sat her down and spread the documents across the table. My name on the letterhead. my signature on the collateral agreements. Derek's voice, very calm, very reasonable, explaining how exposed I was, how easily it could go wrong, how he was the only thing standing between me and a federal investigation I hadn't even known existed. I looked at those papers, Emily said, and I saw your name everywhere, and I thought... She stopped. Her jaw worked. I thought if I said anything, if I called anyone, they would look at those papers and they would see you. Not Derek. You. Her voice broke on the last word, and she pressed her fist against her mouth for a moment, before she could continue. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew I would never risk you. The IRS, I said. She closed her eyes. 8 months after the fire. He showed me the flag on your personal returns, showed me exactly how close it had come. Then he made it go away, and he looked at me like he was doing me a favor. Like he was protecting us. Her hands tightened around the cold mug until her knuckles went pale. And I believed him, Dad. That's the part I can't get past. I believed him because I was so scared, and he was so calm, and I didn't know what else to do. You were alone, I said. He made sure of that. I should have come to you. Emily. I reached over and put my hand over both of hers, covering her white knuckles, feeling the tremor still running through her fingers. Look at me. She opened her eyes. You were living with a man who had looked at everything you loved. I said, and figured out exactly which pieces to threaten. That is not a failure of courage. That is what it looks like when someone is very good at hurting the people closest to them. I held her gaze. You helped Rachel. You preserved the evidence. You held on for 6 years in a situation that would have broken most people completely. That is not something to apologize for. A tear ran down her face, just one this time, slow and quiet. She let it go. The video, she said. Victor sent it this morning. I watched it 3 times before I called you. Her voice dropped to almost nothing. I watched Derek lock that door, Dad. I watched him walk away from it. My chest ached with a depth I had no words for. I tightened my hand over hers. I know, I said. Miguel had a family. I know. I'm going to find them. She looked at me for a long moment. Really looked the way she used to look at me when she was small and had decided I was the person with the answer to whatever was frightening her. What happens now? She asked. I straightened in my chair. Breathed in slowly. Now on, I said, I take care of it. The way I should have been able to take care of it 6 years ago before any of this happened. I squeezed her hands once and released them. But I need one thing from you. Anything. I need you to trust me for a few more days, I said. Don't call Derek. Don't change anything about how you interact with him. Can you do that? Her jaw tightened. Her eyes went hard with something that had nothing to do with tears. Yes, she said. I can do that. I looked at my daughter, 37 years old, sitting in the kitchen of a life that had been slowly poisoned around her for 6 years. Her eyes red and her hands finally still. And I thought about Margaret. About what she would have said standing in this kitchen looking at this child we had made together. She would have said, now you stand next to her. Good, I said. I stood up, bent down, and pressed a kiss to the top of her head, the way I had done since she was 3 years old. I'll handle the rest. Daniel called at 8:40 the next morning. I was at my office desk, going through the motions of a normal Friday, reviewing procurement orders, signing off on a shipping manifest, doing the ordinary work of running a company, while everything underneath the ordinary was anything but. When his name appeared on my screen, I picked up immediately and said nothing, which was the signal we had agreed on for calls that shouldn't start with pleasantries. Derek booked a flight, Daniel said. My pen stopped moving on the page in front of me. When? Thursday of next week, out of JFK. A pause that had weight to it. Los Angeles. One way. I set the pen down on the desk very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands are not entirely steady and you don't want anyone to hear them shake. One ticket, I said. One ticket, Daniel confirmed. I also found the apartment. What apartment? The Midtown, 43rd and Lexington 14th floor. Leased 3 months ago under a subsidiary company name, one of the shells we identified from the USB data. The lease payments have been coming out of the Bennett Equipment Holdings accounts. He paused again. My contact did a welfare check through a building contact this morning. The apartment contains 2 packed suitcases, approximately $30,000 in banded cash, a prepaid phone still in its packaging, and a set of California driver's license documents in Derek's name with a Los Angeles address. The air in my office felt suddenly thinner. I stood up from my desk and walked to the window, the phone pressed against my ear, looking out at the Manhattan skyline, doing what it always did, indifferent, enormous, entirely unconcerned with what was happening in any single office on any single floor. He was never planning to stay, I said. The showroom, the investors, the expansion pitch, it was all one last collection run before he walked out the door. Yes, and Emily was never in the plan. Daniel's voice was careful the way it was careful when he knew the information he was delivering was going to land hard. There is no second ticket, Walter. No provision for her in the apartment, nothing in the financial structure that suggests he intended to bring her along or provide for her in any way. He was going to attend the showroom collect, whatever new investment he could get people to commit to, on the night wire it offshore within 24 hours, and be on a plane to LAX before anyone realized the money was gone. I stood at the window with my free hand pressed flat against the glass, feeling the cold of it travel up through my palm. 10 years. 10 years of Sunday dinners and holiday tables and being called Dad by a man who had apparently looked at my daughter and seen first and foremost a cover story he could walk away from when the time was right. How do we stop him from getting on that plane? I asked. My voice came out low and controlled, which cost me more than I expected. That's what I want to talk to you about. Daniel's tone shifted slightly, becoming more precise, more forward-leaning, the voice he used when he had already thought 3 steps ahead and was ready to lay them out. I have a contact at the FBI field office in Manhattan, Southern District of New York. Her name is Sandra Reyes, Special Agent, 15 years in financial crimes and organized crime. She's the right person for this, Walter. She knows how to build a case that doesn't fall apart at the first defense motion. He paused. But if we bring her in, this becomes federal. Wire fraud, identity theft, conspiracy, those charges don't get walked back. There is no quiet resolution, no private settlement, no keeping any part of this out of the public record. I thought about Derek's voice on that recording. He wasn't supposed to be there. I thought about Miguel Alvarez's family in Brooklyn, who had spent 6 years believing their father died in an accident. I thought about my daughter sitting at her kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a cold mug, her eyes swollen, her whole body still shaking. Good, I said. I don't want a quiet resolution. I thought you'd say that. And there was something in Daniel's voice then, not quite warmth, but the closest approximation of it, that a man who spent 22 years in federal law enforcement tends to manage. I'll set up a meeting with Reyes for tomorrow morning. There's one more thing you need to know before then. Tell me. I drove past the Midtown building this morning, he said. On my way back from the field office, I sat in the car across the street for about 20 minutes. A pause. Derek came out at 7:15. He was carrying a dry cleaning bag over one shoulder and a coffee from the place on the corner. He looked completely relaxed, Walter. The way a man looks when he believes he is several moves ahead of everyone around him and has already decided how the game ends. I looked out at the skyline, at the 10,000 windows of 10,000 offices, each one containing someone's version of ordinary life. "He thinks he's won?" I said. "He does," Daniel said. "Let's make sure Thursday is the last morning he feels that way." I stood at my window for another moment after we hung up. Then I walked back to my desk, sat down, and picked up the procurement order I had been reviewing when Daniel called. I initialed the bottom of the page, moved to the next document, kept working. 40 years of running a business had taught me one thing above everything else. The most dangerous thing you can do in the final phase of any negotiation is let the other side see you move. Derek Hale thought he was several moves ahead. He had no idea the board had already changed. The FBI field office for the Southern District of New York occupied several floors of a federal building in Lower Manhattan, 4 blocks from the courthouse, where I had once testified in a contract dispute and spent 3 hours waiting in a hallway that smelled like floor wax and institutional coffee. Daniel met me in the lobby at 8:55. He was wearing a jacket I had never seen before, dark blue, slightly more formal than his usual flannel, and he had shaved, which told me he understood the weight of what we were walking into. Agent Sandra Reyes met us at the elevator. She was 44 years old, compact and precise in the way of someone who had spent 15 years making herself useful in rooms where people underestimated her and had long since stopped being bothered by it. Dark hair pulled back, a gray blazer over a white shirt. She shook my hand with the firm, brief grip of someone who forms opinions quickly and doesn't revisit them unnecessarily. "Mr. Bennett," she said, "Daniel speaks highly of you." "Daniel speaks carefully about everyone," I said, which I'm learning is its own kind of compliment to something shifted at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but the acknowledgement of one. She led us through a security door and down a corridor to a conference room with a long table, a whiteboard, and a window that looked out at a gray October sky over Lower Manhattan. We sat down. I opened the folder I had brought and began. I talked for 40 minutes without stopping. Reyes listened the way experienced investigators listen, not passively, but actively. Her pen moving in short, precise strokes across her legal pad. Her eyes tracking between me and the documents I laid out on the table one by one. The Polaroid. The printed audio transcripts Daniel had prepared. The financial records Carol had compiled. The storage unit photographs. The timestamp image from Newark. The shell company filings. The loan applications with my forged signature. The video file from the night of the Brooklyn fire. When I finished, the table between us was covered. Reyes looked at everything for a long moment. Then she looked at me. "Mr. Bennett," she said, "what you've brought me this morning is wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and conspiracy. Those are federal charges, Southern District jurisdiction. The arson and the felony murder, those belong to the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office. Kings County jurisdiction, the fire happened in Brooklyn, so it's their case. State charges, state court." She picked up her pen. "I have a colleague at the DA's office. Ada Marcus Webb, he handles major crimes, been there 11 years. I want him in this room this afternoon. We work this together from the start, or we risk the cases stepping on each other in court." "Whatever it takes," I said. "Oh, good." She made a note. "Now Derek Hale has a flight Thursday of next week. That gives us 7 days. Here is what we can do in 7 days." She turned her legal pad to face me, the points already numbered. 1. I apply this morning to Judge Patricia Holloway in the Southern District for a temporary restraining order against all domestic assets connected to Derek Hale and the Bennett Equipment Holdings network. Bank accounts, real estate holdings, business accounts, everything within U.S. jurisdiction gets frozen. He cannot move money, he cannot access. She tapped the second point. 2. I contact Customs and Border Protection this afternoon and request a lookout entry on Derek Hale's passport. He walks up to any checkpoint in any U.S. airport or land border crossing he does not go through. The flight Thursday becomes irrelevant. The Cayman account, Daniel said, 2.1 million. We submit a mutual legal assistance treaty request to the Cayman Islands government in parallel, Reyes said. MLAT takes time, weeks, sometimes months, but the moment that request is filed, the Cayman Financial Authority places a provisional hold. He can't touch it while the request is active, and he can't get to it in person because his passport is flagged. She looked at me steadily. Derek Hale is not getting on a plane, and he is not moving a dollar of that money anywhere. I sat back in my chair and breathed out slowly. 40 years of running a business. 40 years of problems that looked immovable until you found the right lever and applied the right pressure at the right angle. I recognized what Reyes was doing because it was the same thing I had done 100 times across a negotiating table, closing every exit before the other side realized the exits were closing. There's one more element, I said. A witness. Reyes looked up. Rachel Monroe, I said. She was present the night of the Brooklyn fire. She recorded part of what she saw on her phone. That's the video file in front of you. She has been living under a different name in Louisville, Kentucky for 6 years because she was afraid for her safety. I paused. She's willing to come forward, but I need your office to guarantee her protection. Reyes looked at the video file on the table, then at me. She comes in voluntarily. Yes. Then she's a protected witness from the moment she walks through that door, Reyes said. I'll have a victim witness coordinator reach out to her directly. She will not be alone in any of this. She wrote Rachel's name on her legal pad, underlined it once. Mr. Bennett, I want to ask you something directly. Go ahead. The showroom event, next Monday. She set her pen down. Derek Hale is planning to use it to collect investor commitments before he disappears. We could arrest him before then, tonight, tomorrow, any time after Judge Holloway signs the TRO. She looked at me steadily. Or we let him walk into that room believing he's still in control, and we take everything at once in front of the people he's been deceiving for 6 years. A pause. That's your call, Mr. Bennett. Not mine. The conference room was quiet around us. Outside the window, a plane crossed the gray October sky, its contrail dissolving slowly into the cloud cover. I thought about 80 people in a Manhattan showroom. About investors Derek had deceived, partners he had used, employees who had built their livelihoods around a company constructed on stolen credibility. About a man who had called me dad for 10 years and looked at everything I had and seen nothing but material. Let him walk in, I said. Reyes picked up her pen. Then we have work to do, she said. Derek chose the restaurant. He always chose the restaurant. In 10 years of dinners together, I could count on one hand the number of times he had asked where I wanted to go. It was a small thing. The kind of small thing you don't notice until you start noticing everything. The place was on West 53rd, a steakhouse with dark wood paneling, leather booths, lighting that made everyone look slightly more prosperous than they were. Derek was already at the table when I arrived. Jacket draped over his chair, a glass of red wine half finished in front of him. He stood when he saw me, hand extended, smile in place. Dad. His grip was firm and warm. Thanks for making the time. Of course, I said. I sat down and picked up the menu, though I had no intention of tasting anything tonight. "Big week coming up," he said, settling back with the ease of a man entirely comfortable in his own skin. "Wanted to celebrate a little early." The waiter came. Derek ordered for both of us without asking, another old habit I had never examined closely enough. He ordered well. He always ordered well. We talked through the appetizers about the Los Angeles market, about a development in Silver Lake he called transformative. He asked about my knee, about a procurement deal I had mentioned last month, about whether I had been fishing recently. He called me Dad 4 times before the entrees arrived. I counted. I had been counting since Tuesday. The bound presentation came out with the dessert menu professionally printed, tabbed for easy navigation. Derek set it beside my water glass, with the casual confidence of a man who has rehearsed the gesture until it no longer looks rehearsed. "Capital structure for the next phase," he said. "All it needs is your authorization on pages 9, 22, and 38. Collateral agreements, standard language." I picked up the document. Turned to page 9. Read every line the way I read everything now, not the skim of a man who trusts the person who prepared it, but the careful attention of a man who knows exactly what is buried in the language. Page 9. My personal residence in Queens. Page 22. Bennett Industrial Supplies primary operating account. Page 38. The Long Island City warehouse I had owned outright for 19 years. Everything I had built. 3 pages, waiting for my signature. I set it down. "I'll need my own attorney to review this before I sign," I said. Reasonable, unhurried. The voice of a man who had simply learned not to sign things he hadn't read twice. Something moved across Derek's face, a fractional tightening around the eyes, gone in under a second, smoothed back into pleasant confidence so fast that anyone watching would have missed it. "Of course," he said. "The investor window closes Friday, though. I'd hate for us to miss the timing." "I'll have it back to you by Wednesday," I said pleasantly. He nodded, drank. The frustration had disappeared so completely it might never have existed. We finished dinner. He paid without looking at the bill, walked me to the door. Shook my hand on the sidewalk, the same warm grip as always, his breath fogging slightly in the October air. "Having you in my corner has meant everything, Dad." "Good night, Derek," I said. I walked to my car and sat without starting the engine. Through the restaurant window, I could see him at the host stand, already on his phone, shoulders loose, entirely at ease. He had no idea his domestic accounts had been frozen since 10 o'clock that morning. He had no idea his passport had been flagged with U.S. Customs and Border Protection at 2 that afternoon. He had no idea the document he had just slid across a dinner table would be entered into federal evidence before the week was out. I started the engine and pulled into the Friday night traffic of Midtown Manhattan. 3 days. I called Rachel at 9 in the morning. She picked up on the second ring, which told me she had been awake for a while. People who sleep well don't answer phones that fast. "Mr. Bennett," she said. Her voice was steadier than it had been in Louisville, not calm exactly, but the steadiness of someone who has made a decision and is living inside it now rather than debating it. "I need to ask you something," I said. "And I need you to know that whatever you say, the answer doesn't change what's already in motion. The case moves forward either way." A pause. "Ask." Monday evening, Derek is holding a showroom event in Manhattan. 80-plus people, investors, partners, employees. We're going to be there. Federal agents will be in the room. Everything ends that night. I stopped for a moment. "I want to know if you're willing to be there too." The silence that followed was not the silence of someone who hadn't considered it. It was the silence of someone who had been considering nothing else. "Will I be safe?" she asked. Agent Reyes will have people within arm's reach of you from the moment you arrive until the moment you leave, I said. You will not be alone for a single second in that room. Another pause, shorter this time. 6 years, Rachel said. Her voice dropped slightly, weighted with something I recognized, the specific exhaustion of a person who has been looking over their shoulder for so long that they've forgotten what it felt like not to. 6 years of checking the locks twice before bed. 6 years of a bag packed in the closet just in case. Her breath came through the line, unsteady, catching at the edges. I want to look at him, Mr. Bennett. I want to be standing in the room when he understands that it's over. Then be there, I said. I heard her exhale, long and slow, the breath of someone putting something down. Okay, she said. I'll be there. We met at the FBI field office at 2 that afternoon. Daniel, Agent Reyes, ADA Marcus Webb, and a victim witness coordinator named Claire, who had a quiet, unhurried way of explaining things that made complicated situations feel navigable. Rachel joined by secure video call from Louisville, her face on the conference room screen, steady and deliberate. Reyes walked us through the deployment. 6 agents in civilian clothes distributed across the room before the first guest arrived. Webb's team coordinating from outside with the state warrants ready. Claire positioned near the entrance with Rachel. Emily near the front with the laptop and the phone. Daniel at the back. Walter on the floor. The moment Walter puts the documents down and addresses the room, Reyes said, "We move." Not before. We let Derek believe he's in control until the exact second he isn't. Webb looked at me across the table. He was 51, methodical with the particular patience of a prosecutor who had learned that cases won in preparation rather than performance. Mr. Bennett, when you speak in that room, keep it factual. Names, amounts, dates. The evidence speaks for itself. You don't need to argue it. I understand, I said. After the meeting broke up, I drove home through the late afternoon traffic of a Saturday in October, the city's slower, easier families on sidewalks, the trees in Central Park visible from the bridge going full gold in the fading light. I went into the kitchen, made coffee, stood at the counter drinking it while the apartment went quiet around me. On the shelf above the television was a photograph of Margaret and me from the year Emily graduated college. We were standing outside the auditorium in bright May sunshine, Margaret laughing at something I had said, her hand on my arm, both of us squinting against the light. Emily was somewhere behind the camera, making us pose for 5 minutes before she was satisfied. I looked at that photograph for a long time. I found it, Maggie, I said quietly to the empty kitchen. I found all of it. I finished my coffee, rinsed the mug, turned off the kitchen light. 2 days. The showroom occupied the entire ground floor of a converted warehouse building on West 28th Street in Manhattan. Hale Renovation Group had spent 3 months preparing it. Walking in at 6:45 that Monday evening, I had to acknowledge that whatever else Derek Hale was, he understood how to make something look like it was worth trusting. Warm amber light, dark oak surfaces, framed architectural renderings along the walls, a string quartet in the corner playing something understated and elegant. 83 people by the final count. I knew 6 of them were federal agents. I spotted 3 within the first 10 minutes, a woman in a burgundy blazer near the bar who held her champagne glass without drinking from it, a man in a charcoal suit who kept his back to the corner, a younger man near the entrance cataloging the room with his eyes. The other 3 I didn't locate, which meant they were doing their jobs correctly. Daniel stood at the back, a glass of water in his hand, watching everything. Derek arrived at 7. He came through the main entrance with the unhurried confidence of a man walking into a room built to receive him. charcoal suit, well cut, hair neat, expression open and warm and completely at ease. He worked the room from the door inward, shaking hands, laughing at the right moments, remembering names people had mentioned in passing months ago. He was very good at this. He had always been very good at this. He found me at 7:20, and his face lit up with what looked as it always had, like genuine affection. "Dad!" He gripped my hand and held it a beat longer than a standard handshake. "I'm so glad you're here. This wouldn't mean the same without you." "Wouldn't miss it," I said. At 7:45, he took the small stage. He spoke for 12 minutes about vision and persistence and the investors who had believed in him before there was anything to see. He was articulate and compelling, and I stood there with my hands clasped in front of me and my face arranged in the expression of a proud father-in-law. I counted 4 lies in the first 3 minutes. At 8:10, he invited me to the stage. "Walter Bennett, Dad, would you come up?" The room applauded. I walked to the stage and stood beside him under the warm amber lights. An assistant materialized with the bound document staged clearly, and Derek uncapped a pen and held it out with a smile perfectly calibrated to the moment. "It's just a formality," he said quietly for my ears only. The exact words Emily had told me he would say. "Sign tonight and we close the round by Friday." I took the pen, looked at the document, looked at Derek, looked out at 83 faces. People who had eaten at my table, attended my daughter's wedding, sent cards when Margaret died. Then I set the pen down on the podium, stepped slightly to the side so I was addressing the room rather than Derek, and spoke in the same voice I had used for 40 years of board meetings and difficult conversations and moments when the most important thing was not to flinch. "Before I sign anything tonight," I said, "I have a question for everyone in this room." The applause had died. The string quartet had stopped. The only sound was the faint hiss of the ventilation system above the ceiling. "Does anyone here know that the company you've been investing in has been operating under a fraudulent financial identity, built on my name without my knowledge or consent for the past 6 years?" The room went absolutely still. Derek's hand stopped moving toward the document. I watched his face do something I had never seen it do in 10 years of knowing him. It went completely blank. Not angry, not panicked. Empty. The look of a man whose calculations have just returned a result they were not designed to handle. I turned to look at him directly. "Hi, Derek," I said quietly. "We need to talk." Derek opened his mouth to respond. He didn't get the chance. The main entrance doors swung open, and Victor Shaw walked in. He was wearing a dark overcoat and the expression of a man who had come to collect something he was owed, which was exactly what he had come to do. He had scheduled this meeting himself, $900,000 delivered tonight in exchange for his continued silence about a basement in Brooklyn and a back door that had been locked from the outside. He had arrived at 8:15 on the dot, the same time Derek had agreed to, and he had absolutely no idea that the room he was walking into had been rearranged around him while he was in transit. Victor's eyes found Derek across the room. He moved toward the stage without looking at anyone else. "We need to talk," Victor said. His voice was low, but it carried. Several people near the front turned to look. "Tonight. Now." Derek's jaw tightened. "This isn't the time." $900,000 says it is. The room shifted. 83 people who had come for champagne and architectural renderings suddenly understood they were at a different event entirely. The murmuring started at the edges and moved inward like a tide coming in. Derek stepped forward and grabbed Victor's arm, trying to steer him sideways away from the microphone, away from the center of the room. Victor yanked his arm free hard enough that Derek stumbled half a step. And then the side door opened. Rachel Monroe walked in. She was wearing a dark blue coat I had never seen before. Her hair pulled back her chin level. Her eyes moving directly and immediately to Derek's face across 20 feet of polished concrete floor. She had spent 6 years choosing invisibility, smaller apartments, quieter streets, a name that wasn't hers, a life built entirely around not being seen. Tonight, she walked into a room of 83 people, and she did not flinch once. Derek saw her. The color left his face so completely and so fast that the man standing next to him actually reached out a steadying hand, thinking something medical was happening. Derek took one step backward. His heel caught the edge of the stage platform and he grabbed the podium to keep his balance, his knuckles going white around the wood. "Hello, Derek," Rachel said. Her voice was steady and clear and carried to every corner of the room without effort. Victor spun around, stared at Rachel, then stared at Derek, then looked at me. "What is this?" Victor's voice had gone up a register, the smooth confidence of a moment ago, replaced by something rawer and less controlled. "What did you do?" "I replaced my daughter's bed," I said. Emily stepped forward from where she had been standing near the left wall. She crossed the floor with the deliberate calm of someone who has been waiting a long time for this exact moment and is not going to hurry it now that it has arrived. In her right hand was the old phone from the black document bag, the phone that had been sitting under the bedroom floor for 6 years, sealed in the dark, waiting. She stopped in front of Derek. He looked at his wife. The man who had spent 10 years reading every person in every room, who had built a career on knowing exactly what people wanted and giving them just enough of it, looked at Emily, and for the first time that I had ever witnessed, he had absolutely nothing to say. His mouth opened, closed. His hands, which had been steady through 12 minutes of polished speech-making, were shaking now with a fine, visible tremor that he could not seem to control. "Emily," his voice came out wrong, cracked down the middle, stripped of every layer of calibration he had spent a decade applying. "Emily, whatever you think you know." She held up the phone. "I don't think anything," she said. "I know." She pressed play. Rachel's voice filled the room first, tight and urgent, the voice of a woman standing in the dark outside a burning building. "Derek, Miguel is dead." Then Derek's voice. Recorded 6 years ago on a phone that was supposed to be destroyed, speaking with a flatness that made several people in the room audibly draw breath. "I know. You knew he was down there. You locked the back door. He wasn't supposed to be there." The room was absolutely silent, not the polite quiet of an audience waiting for the next speaker. The specific dense silence of 83 people who have just heard something that has permanently changed the shape of what they are looking at. Victor's face had gone gray. He took 2 steps backward, and his shoulder hit the wall behind him, and he stayed there, pressing against it, as though the wall was the only solid thing left in the room. Derek let go of the podium. His hands came up, both of them palms forward, the universal gesture of a man who is about to explain. And I stepped forward and said very quietly, so that only he could hear it, "Don't." Victor broke first. It happened the way things break when they have been under pressure for too long, not with deliberation, not with calculation, but with the sudden, uncontrolled release of something that had been held too tight for too long. So he locked the door. Victor's voice came out loud and ragged, stripped of every layer of the smooth broker composure he had carried into the room 20 minutes ago. He was pointing at Derek, his arm fully extended, his hand shaking. "He is the one who locked that door. I was outside. I told him to stop. I told him Miguel was still in there, and he said, 'Stop talking.' Derek's voice came out low and hard, a command that had worked on Victor for years. It didn't work now. He said it was too late. Victor's voice cracked on the last word, rising into something that wasn't quite a shout, but lived next to one. 6 years I kept that to myself. 6 years I covered for you, and you took $2.1 million out of our accounts, and you didn't tell me, and you were going to... He stopped. His chest was heaving. His face had gone from gray to a dark, mottled red. You bought accelerant on Monday. You were going to do to me what you did to that basement. The room made a sound. Not words, just a collective exhale of 83 people absorbing something they had not come to this building to hear. Derek turned to face Victor fully, and something happened in his expression. The blankness cracked, and underneath it was something older and colder and much more honest than anything he had shown in the past 10 years of Sunday dinners and holiday tables and handshakes that felt like genuine warmth. You took $1.4 million. That wasn't yours, Derek said. His voice was very quiet, very controlled. The voice of a man who understood he was already finished and had decided to burn everything on the way out. You've been skimming since year 2. I knew. I let it go because you were useful, and the moment you stopped being useful, you were going to kill me. Victor said it flatly, as a statement of fact, not an accusation. The same way you killed Miguel Alvarez. The words landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Emily opened her laptop. The video file loaded in 3 seconds, the footage Rachel had recorded 6 years ago on a phone that was supposed to be destroyed, standing across the street from a Brooklyn brownstone at midnight. The projection system Daniel had arranged threw it onto the white wall behind the stage, large enough that everyone in the room could see it clearly. A dark building, a side entrance, 2 figures carrying equipment inside, then one figure emerging alone. Moving to the back of the building, a door being pulled shut, a hand turning a lock. And then through the basement windows, the first orange flicker of light. Derek lunged for the laptop. I stepped in front of him, put my hand flat against his chest, and held it there. He was 41 years old and 30 pounds lighter than me, and he stopped. It's done, I said. He looked at me. His eyes were red at the rims. His jaw was working like he was trying to find words in a language he no longer spoke. For a moment, just a moment, I saw something in his face that might have been the person I thought I had known, looking out from behind everything he had built over it. Then Agent Reyes came through the main entrance. She moved through the room with the efficient, unhurried pace of someone who had rehearsed this exact sequence and trusted the rehearsal. The 5 agents who had been sitting at tables throughout the evening stood up at the same moment, the synchronized movement of it, cutting through the noise and confusion of the room like a signal that needed no translation. "To Derek Hale." Reyes's voice was clear and carried to every corner without effort. "You are under arrest for wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and conspiracy under federal law. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Victor didn't wait to be addressed. He took 2 steps toward the nearest agent with his hands already coming up, and the look on his face was not defiance. It was the look of a man who was profoundly, exhaustedly relieved to have somewhere to put 6 years of what he had been carrying. Derek was handcuffed near the stage he had built. As the agent turned him toward the exit, he looked back over his shoulder. Not at Emily. Not at Rachel. At me. "All of this," he said. His voice was barely above a scrape. "Because of a bed." I looked at him for a long moment. Then I looked at Emily, standing 10 feet away, with her arms at her sides and her chin up, and her eyes clear in a way I had not seen them in longer than I could pinpoint. clear the way eyes go when something that has been pressing against them from the inside has finally been let out. On the bed, I said, just showed me my daughter needed to be saved from the life she'd been carrying alone for too long. Derek had nothing left to say to that. He was walked out of the building he had spent 3 months preparing through the main entrance past the investors and partners and employees who parted to let the agents through out into the October night. The door closed behind him. The room was very quiet. Then Rachel Monroe, standing near the side entrance where she had walked in 20 minutes ago after 6 years of not walking into any room where she might be recognized, let out a long, slow breath that shook slightly at the end. Emily crossed the floor and put her arms around her. I stood where I was and watched my daughter hold the woman she had helped save 6 years ago, and I felt something release in my chest that had been locked there since the morning Caleb handed me a black document bag with both hands and a face the color of concrete. It was over. I washed a dish when I got home. One dish, the coffee mug I had left on the counter that morning before driving to Manhattan, rinsed it under warm water and set it in the rack and stood at the sink for a while afterward, looking at nothing in particular. It was 11:47 at night. The showroom was over. My son-in-law was in federal custody. My hands needed something ordinary to do. Then I went to bed and slept for 9 hours straight, which was the most I had slept in 2 weeks. The weeks that followed moved with the grinding, unglamorous thoroughness of consequence finding its proper shape. Derek Hale was charged in the Southern District of New York with wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and conspiracy. The Brooklyn District Attorney's Office filed separate state charges: arson in the first degree and felony murder. Ada Marcus Webb presented the case to a grand jury 11 days after the arrest. The indictment came back on a Thursday morning, and Daniel called me with the news while I was reviewing a procurement order at my desk, and I set the phone down after we hung up and sat quietly for a moment before going back to the procurement order because the work was still there and it still needed doing. Victor Shaw was charged with the same federal counts and with extortion under New York state law. He had retained an attorney by midnight on the night of the showroom and was already in preliminary cooperation discussions with the U.S. Attorney's Office by the following week. Victor, it turned out, had kept records of everything his own records separate from Derek's maintained with the paranoid thoroughness of a man who had always known this day might come. The prosecutors found them extremely useful. Bennett Equipment Holdings LLC was dissolved by court order. The domestic asset freeze covered nearly $4 million across Derek's various accounts and holdings, all of it subject to forfeiture proceedings. The MLAT request to the Cayman Islands Authority resulted in a provisional hold on the offshore account within 6 weeks. The $2.1 million was not going anywhere. Carol Harper ran Bennett Industrial Supply, while I stepped back from day-to-day operations for the better part of a month. She did not need my help. She had, I realized, been quietly keeping the company functional through 2 years of increasing chaos around its edges, and what she needed from me was simply to get out of her way. I promoted her to Chief Financial Officer on a Wednesday afternoon in November, and she accepted with the precise, contained dignity of someone who had been doing the job for 2 years already and was glad to finally have the title to match. The district attorney's office reviewed Emily's role carefully. The evidence of coercion was extensive and well documented. The forged financial records bearing my name, the IRS audit flag that Derek had manufactured, and then resolved the direct threats that Rachel corroborated in her sworn statement. No charges were filed against Emily. The assistant district attorney who handled the review called me personally to tell me which I had not expected, and I thanked her in the voice I use when I am genuinely grateful, and trying not to show how much. Emily filed for divorce 3 weeks after the showroom. She retained her own attorney, a woman named Patricia Walsh, who had an office in Midtown and a reputation for being exceptionally thorough, and she did not ask me for help with it, which told me she was going to be all right. She moved out of the Westchester house and stayed with a friend in Park Slope for a month, while she figured out what came next. I found Patricia Alvarez on a Saturday morning in November. It had taken me 2 weeks to locate the right address. The family had moved twice since the fire, which was the kind of disruption that follows when a household loses its primary income without warning and without explanation. She lived now in a ground-floor apartment in Flatbush, Brooklyn, with her 2 children. I drove there on a gray November morning and sat in the car outside for 10 minutes before getting out. She answered the door on the second knock. She was 41 years old, with the particular steadiness of a woman who has been the only steady thing in her children's lives for 6 years and has learned to hold that position regardless of what it costs her. She looked at me without recognition at first, and then something shifted in her expression as I introduced myself, and she stepped back and let me in without a word. We sat at her kitchen table. The apartment was clean and warm, a child's drawing pinned to the refrigerator, with a magnet shaped like the state of New York. "Mrs. Alvarez," I said, "I want to tell you something that you should have been told 6 years ago. Your husband did not cause that fire. He was not responsible for what happened that night. He was a man doing his job, and he was failed by people who should have protected him. And I am deeply sorry that it took this long for anyone to say that to you directly." Patricia Alvarez did not cry immediately. She looked at me for a long moment with eyes that had learned to hold a great deal without spilling it. Then she pressed both hands flat on the table between us and looked down at them. "He used to call me on his lunch break," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "Every day, no matter what job he was on, just to check in, to hear my voice." She stopped, drew a slow breath. "My daughter asked me last year why her father had to die because of an accident. I told her that sometimes things happen that nobody intends." She looked up at me. I would like to be able to tell her the truth now. "Yes," I said. "You can tell her the truth now." We sat together at that kitchen table for another 40 minutes. I told her everything I was legally able to tell her. I told her about the case, about the charges, about what the evidence had established. I told her that her husband's name would be said clearly in a federal courtroom, and that the people responsible for what happened to him were going to be held to account for it. Before I left, I gave her the name of an attorney who handled wrongful death civil cases and had agreed to take her situation under review. She walked me to the door. On the threshold, she stopped and looked at me with an expression I did not entirely know how to receive. It was not gratitude exactly, and it was not forgiveness, and it was not peace. It was something more complicated than any of those things, the expression of a person who has just been handed back a truth that was taken from them and is still in the process of understanding what to do with it. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I should have come sooner," I said. I drove back to Queens through the gray November streets and packed 2 suitcases and a box of books. I had already arranged the sale of the house, a young family from New Jersey, 2 kids, a dog, exactly the kind of life a house like that deserved to hold. I signed the closing paperwork on a Tuesday, handed over the keys, and drove north out of the city for the first time in longer than I could remember, without a destination that had anything to do with work. The lake house was in the Catskills, 2 hours north of the city, on a state road that wound through hills that had gone full brown and gold by late October and were bare now in November. The trees skeletal against the gray sky, the lake flat and pewter-colored, and completely still in the mornings. Margaret and I had bought it the year Emily was born. We had spent exactly 1 summer there before the company demanded too much of my time, and the visits became less frequent, and eventually stopped altogether. I had been paying the property taxes on it for 37 years, mostly out of stubbornness. Emily arrived the second weekend. She had rented a car and driven up alone, which told me she was ready to make decisions on her own terms again. She came through the door with a grocery bag in each arm and looked around the living room with the expression of someone recalibrating their expectations in real time. "It's smaller than I remembered," she said. "You were 4 the last time you were here," I said. Everything was smaller. She set the groceries on the counter and looked out the window at the lake, which was reflecting a thin, gray winter light in a way that was not beautiful exactly, but was very honest. "I like it," she said. We made dinner together that evening, pasta, a simple red sauce bread from the bakery in the town 12 miles down the road. We ate at the table by the window with the lake going dark outside, and Emily told me about a design project she had taken on a small residential renovation in Brooklyn for a family she had met through a colleague. She talked about it with a specific forward-leaning energy that I had not heard in her voice for years, the energy of someone making plans that belong entirely to themselves. After dinner, I washed and she dried, the way we had done when she was young, and Margaret was still alive, and the kitchen was full of people. Later, we sat on the porch with coffee, even though it was cold enough that our breath fogged, and we had both put on extra layers before coming outside. The lake was invisible in the dark, but we could hear it a faint occasional lapping at the dock below. "Dad," Emily said. "Do you remember the bed you bought me?" I looked out at the dark water. $3,000, I said. "Of course I remember." She turned her coffee mug in both hands slowly. "I've been thinking about it a lot. That morning. You just wanted to do something nice." "I did." "You had no idea." "No," I said. "I had absolutely no idea." She was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone who has nothing to say, but the quiet of someone choosing carefully among the things they want to say and settling on the one that matters most. "I'm glad it was you," she said finally. "That found it. I used to lie awake at night and think about that bag sitting under the floor, and I'd think, what if the wrong person found it? What if Derek found it first, or someone he sent?" She exhaled slowly into the cold air. "But it was you. It was just you trying to do something kind." I looked at my daughter sitting beside me in the cold November dark. Her hands wrapped around a coffee mug, her face turned toward the invisible lake. "Your mother used to say that the right things have a way of finding the right moment," I said. I never entirely believed her. Do you now? I thought about a Tuesday morning in October, about a floorboard that shifted when 2 men lifted a bed frame, about a waterproof bag in the dark that had been waiting 6 years for exactly that moment to exist. "Yes," I said. "I think I do." Emily leaned her head against my shoulder, the way she had done since she was small, and we sat there on the porch of the lake house in the November cold, listening to the water move against the dock below. And I thought about Margaret, who had loved this place, and about Miguel Alvarez, who had deserved more than 6 years of silence, and about all the ordinary mornings that add up to a life, and how sometimes the most important thing a person can do is simply show up and do something kind and trust that the rest will follow. I was 65 years old. I had lost a wife I loved for 38 years. I had lost a son-in-law I thought I knew. I had lost the comfortable certainty of a life I had believed I understood completely. But I had my daughter back fully honestly in the way that only becomes possible when the thing that was standing between 2 people has finally been removed. And I understood something that I had perhaps always known, but never needed to say aloud. Until now, the biggest secrets don't always live in safes or locked rooms or offshore accounts. Sometimes they live in the most ordinary places imaginable. Sometimes they live beneath the thing you look at every single day. Waiting for a floorboard to shift. Waiting for a bed to be moved. Waiting for a father to decide to do something kind for his daughter. I spent 65 years believing that trust given freely was the highest form of love. I still believe that. But I have learned the hard way, in the most personal way a man can learn anything, that trust without awareness is not love. It is a door left open in the dark. I am not a perfect father. I missed things I should have seen. I trusted people I should have questioned. And I paid for that with 6 years of my daughter's life that she spent afraid, alone, carrying something no one should carry by themselves. Don't be like me. Pay attention. Not with suspicion, but with eyes fully open. God has a way of using the smallest things to reveal what we were never meant to carry alone. A Tuesday morning. A bed frame lifted by 2 ordinary men. A floorboard that shifted at exactly the right moment. These are the family stories where revenge looks nothing like the movies. Real family drama and revenge are quieter than that. It is patience, documentation, and trusting the right people at the right time. The most powerful family stories, revenge, I have ever witnessed was simply the truth, walking into a room and refusing to leave. If this story moved something in, you leave a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next on this channel. Thank you for staying until the very end. Some stories on this channel contain fictional elements crafted purely for educational purposes. If that's not the content you're looking for, no hard feelings at all. Step away and find what serves you best. But if you're still here, I'll see you in the next one.